Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Schneider and I want to talk to you today about accessibility. It's May 21st, 2026, and that means it is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. This talk that I'm going to go through today with you is a talk that I recently gave to the current student cohort at Per Scholas Seattle. Per Scholas Seattle offers virtual and in-person IT training, gets learners equipped with AI-enabled tech skills at no cost, and also helps companies find the tech talent they need to meet their business goals. I'm not affiliated with Per Scholas. I don't work for them. I'm just a volunteer there, but I think that they do good work, and I've been impressed with what I've seen every time that I've gone and volunteered with them. So, accessibility for IT professionals. What are we going to talk about today? Let's just go over that real quick. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. I don't put out a lot of videos here, so maybe a little bit of information about myself just so you can know who I am and where I'm coming from. And then we're going to talk about the different disabilities. And so we're going to start at the beginning for people who are just getting started in the IT world and the different kinds of things that they need to know about it, especially the different pieces of assistive technology that someone with disabilities might use in order to interact with the real world or the digital world. We're also going to talk about some IT specific topics in terms of doing things in the workplace or how to best help colleagues or clients with disabilities. When I did this talk in person, of course, I had questions, harder to do in video format, but if you do have any questions or think that I got something wrong, go ahead and put it down in the bottom there in the comments. I like to say that I'm always learning. I do still get things wrong, even though I've worked in accessibility for a fairly long time. And if you think that I got something wrong or have additional information to add, we'd love to hear it. So, like I said, my name is Aaron Schneider. I've been a software engineer professionally for about 25 years. The first 15 years I spent in video games working on titles such as the SOCOM US Navy SEALs titles and also Plants vs. Zombies 2 on mobile. And after that, I spent some time working at Amazon. So I worked in Kindle and then moved to an accessibility team and also worked in both Kindle and stores accessibility, helping make sure that Amazon's customers could read on Kindle devices and also shop online on Amazon.com. I no longer work at Amazon, so everything I say here is obviously my own opinion and a product of the learning that I've done through Amazon, but that's a little bit of background on me. I think the most interesting part, or my biggest claim to fame, is that I am the voice of Toadstool in Plants vs. Zombies 2. So why is accessibility important, especially for people working in IT? Well, as IT professionals, part of your job may be to troubleshoot hardware issues or assist people with setting up their software. Some of those people that you are helping may have disabilities, and I want you to be prepared. What we're talking about today isn't going to make you an accessibility expert, but my hope is that when you do go out into the world, you won't be surprised when you encounter colleagues with disabilities. You'll have a bit of a background for understanding how some of these technologies work that people use, and so that you won't be surprised by them and you'll have some knowledge maybe that you can fall back on to get yourself started when you are trying to help out people with disabilities. Let's define some terms. So impairments is kind of an older word. It's more of a medical term. It's not something that we generally talk about. We don't talk about people with disabilities in terms of their impairments now. Impairments just is like the actual attributes that affect a person. For instance, being blind, deaf, unable to walk, having tremors, or autism or ADHD or any other of those like sort of more medical diagnoses. We don't tend to refer to people in terms of their impairments. Instead, we refer to them in terms of people with disabilities. And disability really is about the barriers that people face. So someone in a wheelchair, for instance, is not disabled just because they can't walk or because they are in a wheelchair. They're disabled by perhaps the lack of a ramp allowing them to enter a building. They're disabled by the barriers that the environment, society, or attitudes or software put in place that prevent them from completing tasks or doing things that they want to do. Someone who's in a wheelchair and having a conversation with you may not be disabled in that situation. They could be just having a regular conversation with you easily, and the fact that they're in a wheelchair doesn't really enter into that situation. Accessibility is breaking down those barriers. So removing barriers so that everybody, people with disabilities or not, can interact with the world, do things that they want to do, or use the software and tools that they want to use. There used to be an old model of disability called the medical model of disability. It's older. We don't use it as much anymore, but this model, how we used to think about disability in terms of impairments that people had, and that these impairments needed to be fixed or overcome by the people who had them. Nowadays, we much prefer to talk about the social model of disability, which is that people are disabled not by their physical or mental attributes, but by the environment, the systems, or the attitudes placed in society, as opposed to their physical or mental attributes. Today, people with disabilities generally prefer to think about accessibility in terms of the social model. And I think it's a lot more useful to think about that as well in terms of being able to help people and to make the world a more inclusive and accessible place. Focusing on the environment, the barriers that are present in the environment, those are things that we can change, that we can improve, that we can affect in order to make the world a more inclusive and accessible place. I think another important thing to understand about disability, two important things to understand about disability, disabilities aren't always permanent. The same environmental barriers that affect people with permanent disabilities can be present for people in specific situations or just be temporary. Some people are born with disabilities. Many others disabilities are acquired through accident, illness, or old age. And so when we think about someone who's maybe missing an arm, as we're showing here in this screen here, only having use of one arm puts you in a similar ability to accomplish tasks as perhaps someone who is holding a baby or someone who has a broken arm. Each of these people, whether their disability at that point in time is permanent, situational, or just temporary, is still going to face similar barriers. Acquiring disabilities or becoming a person with disabilities often is just a fact of aging. Now, if we live long enough, we're likely to develop one or more disabilities. For instance, I'm wearing glasses right now. I didn't wear glasses until I was in my 20s. Without them, I would have a hard time reading my notes. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself disabled, but I would have a hard time with some tasks. And in an emergency, in a building, if I didn't have my glasses, about all I could do is look around for the bright glowing exit signs. We're going to talk about disabilities now today and divide them into three major groups: motor, sensory, and cognitive. And I want to be clear that dividing disabilities up into these three groups isn't an attempt to sort people or disabilities into categories. It's just a way to structure this talk. It's a way to help us talk about the disabilities by grouping them together, but it is in no way meant to categorize or segregate people based on different disabilities that they might have. So, motor disabilities. Motor disability is one that affects the use of your body. Missing limbs, limb differences are some of the most obvious, along with things like paralysis, speech disabilities, palsies and tremors, muscle and joint pain, things that might prevent you from using your body completely or might cause you pain or discomfort using some activities. For instance, muscle and joint pain might make it impossible or difficult to use a mouse for any length of time. So we need to have other assistive technology or other devices or other options for people who have these disabilities. I want to talk for a little bit first about wheelchairs, and I'll go into a bit about wheelchairs, but the first thing I want to say about when you're interacting with someone who is in a wheelchair is that you should treat their wheelchair just like you treat their body. Unless it's an emergency situation, don't just grab their wheelchair and start pushing. If you want to help, that's fine. Just ask first. There are many different kinds of wheelchairs, from ones that you might find that sort of more standard models that you might find in a hospital or that you could rent at an airport, to motorized wheelchairs. There's even standing wheelchairs that'll lift a person up to eye level or help them get to a higher elevation in order to do tasks. And there are also racing wheelchairs. Wheelchair varieties are many and varied. They're all wheelchairs. One of the things that has changed over the last few decades about wheelchairs is the more ubiquitous use of wheelchair ramps. So wheelchair ramps are there to help make sure people can get inside of buildings. In many cases, it's mandated that buildings have wheelchair accessible ramps, but we still do see some, I would say, laughable examples of wheelchair ramps that don't work that well. One like this, where in order to get up or down onto the ramp, you have to go up a set of stairs. Not particularly useful. Or wheelchair ramps like this one that is close to a steep set of stairs and has the same grade. It would be, I would imagine, almost impossible for someone to get up this wheelchair ramp shown here, let alone the danger of someone starting down this wheelchair ramp, not realizing how steep it was going to be at the end. And we have an example, this last example of a wheelchair ramp, which has two flat parts, but still has some steps in the middle. It's better. It does have a railing on the side. It does have some landings, which we like to see, which make things a little better. But those steps in the middle can still be a challenge. Use of this sort of style of ramp is going to require people to be somewhat precise in their movements of their wheelchair, lest a wheel come off of the flat surface back onto the steps, and then requiring or being difficult or impossible for that person to get themselves unstuck and back onto the ramp. Good wheelchair ramp is going to have landings, it's going to have railings either on both sides or a curb to help keep wheelchairs from falling off the side. And these are all really important for wheelchairs, but the great thing about wheelchair ramps or some other pieces of assistive technology like them is something that we call the curb cut effect. And the curb cut effect is referring to those sloped parts of curbs that come down and make it easier for wheelchair users to get up and down off a curb in order to be able to cross a street. These didn't always exist decades ago. They were not nearly as ubiquitous as they are nowadays because we've legislated their requirements. But many people beyond just wheelchair users take advantage of these curb cuts. People with strollers, people on skateboards, people on bicycles, someone with a dolly carrying a heavy load might make use of these curb cuts in order to get up and down off the road more easily. And the curb cut effect is just that. It's just saying that when we make something more accessible for people with disabilities, we're also making it more useful and accessible and valuable for people who don't have disabilities. Everyone enjoys better design, like curb cuts. One last bit about wheelchairs, which is that oftentimes someone who is using a wheelchair, if they have a phone, they may have their device in a set position on their phone. And so as an IT professional, when you're evaluating software or when you're looking at adopting new software, it's important to think about whether that software, if it's going to be used on a mobile device, supports landscape mode. Because someone may have their device fixed in landscape mode, and it can be difficult or almost impossible for them to rotate the device if the app you're trying to adopt doesn't support both portrait and landscape. And so as you are evaluating software for use in your organization, if it has a mobile component to it, make sure that you are checking to see that both landscape and portrait modes are available. Another piece of assistive technology that someone with a motor disability might use would be voice control. Voice control is now already built into some operating systems, or most all operating systems. On Windows and Android, it's called voice access. On Mac and iOS, we call it voice control. There are also third-party companies. Many, Dragon and Fable, are some of the more popular ones or more well-known out there. But the idea is that you can control your computer with a voice. If using a keyboard or using a mouse is more difficult for you, then using voice control may be something that enables you to more easily use your computer or your mobile device. There's another example here where the curb cut effect takes place, which is that nowadays, with AI becoming more and more prevalent in offices, we're starting to hear reports of offices where when they're using AI a lot, they're no longer typing their prompts to the AI. They're in fact in an office setting using their voice in order to prompt their AI to do things. So we've gone from offices which are hearing clicks and clacks and taps of mice to just people whispering to their computers. And they're taking advantage of this voice technology, which has long been used by people with disabilities to control their devices, to now be a benefit for people who are not necessarily disabled to be able to do their work. There's some other alternative input devices that people with motor disabilities or people who have limited control over their bodies or lack fine dexterity control that makes maybe using a mouse difficult might be using. Their adaptive mice or vertical mice, which can alleviate wrist strain or just make it easier to use a mouse. There are adaptive keyboards that are larger in terms of the keys that they have on, making it easier for people who have a hard time precisely typing keys to use a keyboard. There are also switch pads, or switch devices, which have two large, essentially keyboard keys on them that they'll use in order to navigate on their computer. And I'll prompt you to try out an exercise in a bit that sort of shows you kind of what that would be like. There are sip and puff sticks where you can use your breath to control your computer. And some people might use typing wands, either held in their mouth or attached to their head in order to tap and use their mobile devices. Let's talk about keyboard navigation. This isn't just for keyboards, but for people who maybe can't or find it difficult to use a mouse, or people who are using those switch pads or the sip and puff sticks that I was talking about. And keyboard navigation is really valuable for people who have particular forms of motor disability, who can only use a keyboard or who can only use those switch devices. And what happens is you essentially are just using two keys on your keyboard or the two buttons on the switch device. It's a little more complicated than that when it gets down to it, or there's a little more power that you can have depending on the device you have. But in general, they'll be using something like, say, the tab key to move around on the page and the enter key to activate elements. And this box around elements on a screen or a web page is something we call the focus indicator, and it tells you kind of where you are on the page or what element currently has focus. And if you tab through, say like I have here on the Per Scholas Seattle page, if you press tab, it'll go from one element to another. And that tells us that we are moving around the page, and it tells us where we are on the page by looking for this box. So the exercise that I would love for everyone here to try would be to try to use your keyboard to complete a task. So go to Amazon.com, use your keyboard to complete a task, and restrict yourself to not using the mouse, but only using tab to move forward and enter to activate things. You can use shift tab, holding down shift and pressing tab will move you backwards in the order. But I really recommend that everyone give this exercise a try. Go ahead and pause the video and try to just go to Amazon.com and add something to your cart using just your keyboard without actually making use of your mouse. I'll pause here and let you do that. Now, if you haven't finished the exercise, go ahead and just pause when you do come on back. I'll talk about some of the barriers that you likely encountered as you were trying to complete that task. First barrier that you potentially encountered is it might be difficult to figure out where the focus indicator has moved on the screen. Sometimes it jumps around. Amazon, I think, actually does a pretty good job of having it go from left to right and top to bottom, so it has a pretty predictable focus order, but not every web page or app is like that. Sometimes it can be more difficult to find the focus indicator. Sometimes people disable focus indicators entirely, making it very difficult to know where you are on a page. I think one of the biggest challenges, biggest barriers that you might find is just that it takes a lot more key presses to do something. Whether you're on Amazon or any other website, it takes a lot more key presses to do something than it would with a mouse. Amazon's done some great work to provide additional keyboard shortcuts and in-page links in order to make navigation easier, but that sort of technology isn't necessarily ubiquitous and isn't used everywhere, and so it still remains a barrier for many people. Let's move on from talking about motor disabilities and talk about sensory disabilities. The two most common ones that you might think of are deafness and blindness, the loss of sight, loss of hearing. Other senses can also be affected though, such as losing your sense of taste or smell or touch. These of course are disabilities, but they don't get quite as much attention as deafness and blindness because they don't, I think, tend to affect the way people interact with the world or their ability to get a job quite as much as losing your sight or your hearing. So it's also important to note that these disabilities, like many others, are on a scale. Some blind people can see a little bit. Some deaf people have some hearing. Just because someone doesn't look or act like they have a disability doesn't mean they don't have one. Many disabilities can be invisible. Let's talk about deafness. So when we think about deafness and hard of hearing, some of the assistive technology or ways we can support people who have had loss of hearing. One of the first ones that comes to mind is mono audio. Many videos, music, and other things split the audio channels into left and right. And so different sounds will be coming in the left ear than the right ear. If you happen to be deaf in one ear but not the other, you need all the audio to come through both sides, or at least on your hearing sides. So going into your operating system settings related to audio, changing from stereo to mono will help some people who have had hearing loss get all the information that they need to get from, say, like training videos or other pieces of media that are required for their jobs. Also visual alerts. Many times in software we see that there's just an audio alert that something has happened in order to draw your attention to it. There needs to also be some visual alerts. This can happen in the real world too, where you may have seen in some hotel rooms that the phones will have a flashing light. Or if you look at any fire alarms in any buildings, they will not only produce a sound for the fire alarm, but they'll also have a flashing light that goes off. And that's to make sure that people, regardless of their disability, can be notified that there's an emergency situation going on. Videos and whatnot also need captions. If you can't hear the audio for training videos or material like that, all of those things need to have captions so that people who can't hear the audio and can't hear the instructions that are there can be able to read and receive the information that they need to receive. Sometimes you'll encounter people who use hearing aids. Nowadays, a lot of hearing aids have Bluetooth connectivity in them, and so people will use their hearing aids not just as hearing aids, but also as headphones that they connect to their devices. Same with cochlear implants, which are medical devices that are actually surgically implanted down in the ear to stimulate the nerve. Many of these do have Bluetooth connectivity nowadays, and so people will want to be able to use them and connect them to their devices in order to use them as their headphones. There are lots of pieces of software, sometimes even operating systems that come into conflict with that Bluetooth, or you could just be in an area that has a lot of signal noise in it, and so it may fall to you as an IT professional to help resolve those problems. Another sensory disability that is important in the workplace is color vision deficiency. It's more commonly known as color blindness, or at least it used to be more commonly known as color blindness. We're sort of trying to move away from using the term blindness because that gives potentially the wrong impression. Most forms of color vision deficiency, people can still differentiate color. It's just particular spectrums of color that they can't differentiate. There are forms of color vision deficiency where you can't differentiate color, so you sort of just see everything in terms of contrast and tones. But for the most part, it's just particular spectrums. It's mostly men that are affected. About 1 in 12 men have some form of color blindness. In women, it's more rare. Only about 1 in every 200 people have color blindness. The assistive technology that you might want to know about or might want to use at your operating system level is something called color filters. It's called the same thing across all the different operating systems. And what color filters will do is they'll sort of remap the color spectrum that's put out on your screen or your monitor so that it ends up using colors that are differentiated enough that someone with color vision deficiency can see them. And of course, there's blind and low vision. Like I said earlier, it exists on a spectrum. There are people who have limited vision, and there are people who are completely blind and have no vision whatsoever. For the people on one end of the spectrum, the ability to change the default font size in your operating system, it can be really valuable. Google actually did a study a few years back looking at the most common or most valuable forms of assistive technology or operating system settings that people can set, and being able to increase the font size was one of those. There are a lot of people who benefit from assistive technology who don't necessarily consider themselves disabled, and because of that, they don't always look under accessibility settings in order to figure out operating system settings that might help them or make it easier to use their devices. Font size increases is one of those. There are a lot of people out there for whom increasing the font size of their device, their operating system, would really be valuable. They just don't know to go look for it. High contrast mode is another one for people who have difficulty differentiating certain colors. High contrast mode will boost the contrast between colors. People who have narrower fields of vision, operating systems include something called a screen magnifier. It's essentially a software implementation of a physical magnifying glass that will magnify the area around your mouse cursor as you are using the device to make it easier to see or read what is on your screen. And then of course there are screen readers. We'll talk about these last two a little more here in the next slide. First, the screen magnifier. I just wanted to give you an example or show you kind of what it looked like. Here it is on Mac OS, where I have the mouse cursor. There is a larger box that is expanding or magnifying the content that is around my cursor. So for folks with low vision, using this sort of a magnifying glass might help them better use their software. And then we have screen readers. So screen readers are somewhat similar or a more advanced version of the keyboard navigation that we talked about earlier. Screen readers are a piece of software that is integrated into all major operating systems at this point that allows users to navigate around just using their keyboard or on mobile device just using swipes to navigate from one element on the page or screen to the next and to activate or interact with those elements just using their keyboard without the use of a mouse or other pointing device. The difference between the keyboard navigation and screen readers, the biggest difference that you notice is that screen readers will use a text-to-speech engine that will read out what the text of the current item that is being highlighted. So I wanted to give you a little example of what that sounds like.
Heading level 2, level 1, link, menu, end of, banner. Heading level 1, Seattle, group. You link, set as default location. You are currently on a link. Inside of Per Scholas, Seattle offers virtual and in-person IT training in Seattle, equipping learners with essential AI-enabled tech skills at no cost. We help companies find the tech talent they need to meet their business goals and connect graduates directly with job opportunities at employer partners like Tech Systems. Fully remote and in-person courses are available.
So you could hear that everything on that Per Scholas Seattle website that was highlighted was being read out by the screen reader. Screen readers actually have a lot of additional affordances like being able to navigate by headings, being able to get an overall view of the page layout, many other things that make navigation a little bit more streamlined and efficient than we have with keyboard navigation, but it is something that is used often by blind users in order to interact with software. It might not necessarily be just blind users that use screen readers. Sometimes people with motor disabilities might find screen readers a more efficient and easier way to interact with their devices. It's available on all of the major operating systems. On Windows, it's called Voice Access. On Mac and iOS, it's called VoiceOver. Android calls theirs TalkBack. They have some slight differences, but they all essentially perform the same function. There are also third-party screen readers like JAWS and NVDA. The key here is that someone who is blind who uses a screen reader may have a preference about which screen reader they're most comfortable with and which screen reader they're used to. So it may fall to you to help support that, either by providing them a device that works with the operating system and has the screen reader they're used to, or by installing some software like JAWS and NVDA, making sure that the provisioning of a new device for that person includes the software that they want to use and that they're used to. One thing to note about screen readers is that the people who use screen readers, as they become more comfortable with it and use it longer and longer over time, they'll speed up the rate at which the voice speaks to them. And so, whereas the speaking voice that we just heard was a fairly comfortable one that I can understand, people who use screen readers for a long period of time will increase the rate at which the TTS reads things out to them, and this becomes a very natural speed for them to listen to things. I want to give you an example of kind of what that might sound like, because I think it's often surprising to people who haven't used screen readers before.
Heading level 2, level 1, link, menu, end of, banner. Heading level 1, Seattle, group. Link, set as default location. Per Scholas, Seattle offers virtual and in-person IT training in Seattle, equipping learners with essential AI-enabled tech skills at no cost. We help companies find the tech talent they need to meet their business goals and connect graduates to direct group.
All right, so that was pretty fast. It was somewhat difficult for me to understand what it was saying, but for a screen reader user who finds that speed comfortable, it can be very easy. One of the things you may have to do when you're supporting someone who's using a screen reader is ask them to slow down the screen reader speed so that you can also understand it. And that's usually fairly easy for them to do. It just requires you to ask. Last thing to mention, I think, on sensory disabilities for this talk and on screen readers in general is PDF accessibility. Lots of organizations love PDFs, especially government organizations. The challenge with PDFs is that PDFs are really a display format and not really a reading format. And so the underlying code for a PDF is really just saying, hey, draw an image over here, put some text here on the screen, then maybe put some more text over here, draw this character bigger, that sort of thing. There's no implicit or inherent reading order to the content of a PDF. And so lots of work needs to be done on PDFs to make them accessible to screen readers so the screen reader understands what the order that text comes in. This is especially important. This sort of remediation is very important for government work where the government puts out a lot of PDFs and is legally required to make sure that those PDFs are accessible. I'm not an expert in making PDFs accessible, and it's a much larger topic in and of itself, but it is something to be aware of if you are providing, say, instructional materials to someone on how to do something, to make sure that those PDFs are accessible to screen readers. All right, let's talk somewhat briefly about the third category of disability that we're talking about today, which is cognitive disabilities. These are disabilities that affect brain functions, and they may affect the different parts of your cognitive state, such as learning, memory, and comprehension. Examples include autism and ADHD, dementia, even PTSD. And cognitive disabilities get talked about, I think, less a bit than other disabilities. They sometimes have a much wider range of the disability. There's often not a lot of assistive technology that we can implement in order to support cognitive disabilities. But there are still some things that we can do. For instance, not requiring people to solve memory puzzles, limiting the amount of information that someone has to hold in their head and remember at any given time, reducing the amount of information that someone has to enter, so auto-filling out a form field as much as possible before presenting it to someone, making sure you're saving those things so that they can restart if they need to, and also just keeping the reading level of materials that you create at around a 5th grade level in order to be able to be read and comprehended by as many people as possible. That's the end of part 1 of this presentation. In part 2, I'll discuss more about specific accessibility related topics for IT professionals and have some pointers on how to interact with people with disabilities. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a wonderful Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Let's get out there and make the world a more accessible and inclusive place.